A few years into understanding money at a deeper level, I realized something most people never get taught clearly enough. Being good with money is not about being a genius. It is not about loving spreadsheets. It is not about waking up before sunrise to read the financial press and then speaking in acronyms at breakfast so everybody knows you are serious. It is not even about stock tips, clever hacks, or sounding sophisticated when somebody says the words inflation, index fund, or passive income. It is about understanding a few principles so clearly that the rest of your financial life stops feeling random. That is the shift. Before that shift, money feels slippery. It comes in, it goes out, you work hard, you try to be responsible, you make little adjustments. You feel briefly proud of yourself. Then somehow the account balance still feels thinner than it should, the future still feels foggy, and the whole subject carries more guilt than clarity. After that shift, money starts behaving differently in your mind. The noise dies down. Not because life becomes cheap, not because risk disappears, because you finally understand the machinery, and when you understand the machinery, you stop mistaking motion for progress that matters. Because an astonishing number of people live their entire adult lives without ever being shown the small handful of ideas that explain almost everything important about personal finance. Not everything. I do not believe in that kind of exaggeration. There are details, there are edge cases, there are countries, legal distinctions, inheritance structures, pensions, insurance complications, business issues, debt structures, and all the usual exceptions that professionals get paid to sort out. Fine, but underneath all of that sits a simpler foundation. If you understand that foundation, the details stop terrifying you. If you do not understand the foundation, then no amount of detail will save you because you will still be reacting to money instead of directing it. So I want to walk you through the 6 ideas that matter most here, because I think the original document is right about something very important. Most people do not need 50 more finance tips. They need the core architecture. And the first part of that architecture is something so ordinary that people almost miss how destructive it is. Inflation, I call it the silent tax, because that is what it feels like. Once you really understand what it is doing, when I was younger, I thought saving money in a bank account automatically meant I was becoming more secure. That is the story everybody is quietly encouraged to believe. Be responsible, put money aside. Watch the number go up, feel adult, feel prudent, feel safe. It is a beautiful story. It is also incomplete to the point of being dangerous, because the number in the account can rise while the value of that money falls. That is the part people do not feel until years later, and by then the damage has already done its work quietly enough that most of them still call themselves prudent, while the purchasing power has been leaking away beneath them the whole time. That is inflation. Not some abstract chart on television, not some economist's favorite talking point, a slow reduction in what your cash can actually buy. If prices rise 3% and your money earns almost nothing, then you are not preserving wealth. You are watching it thin out politely. That is why the silent tax idea matters so much. The government does not need to send you a nasty letter saying we have decided to take a little more from your future. The system can just let inflation do the work, and ordinary savers, especially cautious ordinary savers, pay the price without ever receiving the emotional satisfaction of knowing exactly when they were robbed. That is one of the ugliest forms of wealth loss, because it does not feel dramatic enough to wake people up early. It just makes their money less capable over time. Now, I want to be very careful here. Cash is not stupid. A lot of finance people become so intoxicated by growth language that they start talking as if every dollar not invested in risk assets is a sign of weakness or ignorance. That is foolish. Cash has a purpose: emergency fund, near-term spending, peace of mind, optionality. You do not walk through life without dry powder simply because an online voice told you the market always goes up eventually. Adults need liquidity, but what adults do not need is sleepwalking. If you are going to hold cash, you should at least know whether it is sitting in the most productive, safe place available to it. A basic savings account paying almost nothing is not virtue. It is negligence disguised as caution. That is the first pillar. Money can lose value even when it looks stationary and safe. If you do not understand that, you will overestimate what your savings are doing for you and underestimate how much the future is quietly costing. Now we move to the second idea, which sounds simple but changes everything once it becomes real in your mind. Saving and investing are not the same act. Most people use the words as if they are interchangeable. They are not, and the confusion between them is one of the main reasons so many people stay financially frozen longer than they need to. Saving is holding cash. That means safety, accessibility, and low volatility. It also usually means weak long-term growth. That is fine because not all money is supposed to grow aggressively. Some money is supposed to wait. Some money is supposed to protect you from chaos. Some money is supposed to be there when the car breaks, when the boiler fails, when the job vanishes, when the dog needs surgery, when life remembers it can still embarrass you on a Tuesday afternoon. That is what savings is for. You are not trying to get rich with your emergency fund. You are trying not to become desperate. That is a different mission. Investing is different. Investing is the act of exposing money to assets that can grow over time. Shares, funds, property, ownership claims on productive enterprise. Things with volatility. Yes, but also with genuine capacity to outpace inflation and increase purchasing power over a long enough span. That is how wealth is built. Not because the process is glamorous, because the world tends to reward ownership over long periods more than it rewards the mere possession of cash. That is the brutal truth. Cash preserves short-term flexibility. Ownership grows long-term wealth. You need both, but you need to know which bucket each dollar belongs in. I think of saving as the foundation of the house. If you do not pour the foundation, then the first shock cracks everything. But if all you ever do is pour foundation, then you have a very sturdy slab and nowhere to live. That is what too many people are doing with money. They save and save and save because investing feels complicated or risky or grown up in a way that makes them nervous. And meanwhile, they are missing the very engine that turns discipline into actual long-term wealth. This is where timing becomes so important, not because you must guess some perfect market entry, because the question is not only whether you invest, it is when you begin. A person who waits until she feels fully informed is usually waiting far too long. The market does not reward perfect emotional readiness. It rewards time. That is the third pillar, compounding. People use grand language around compounding because it deserves some of it. You put money in, it earns a return. Next period, you earn a return not only on the original principal, but on the prior return as well. Then that return earns its own return. The thing begins modestly. So modestly, in fact, that most people give up before it becomes visible enough to feel magical. That is why compounding is so psychologically difficult for ordinary people. Its early stage is deeply unromantic. You save, you invest, you check, and almost nothing seems to happen. That is the trap. Human beings are bad at respecting forces that begin quietly. We like immediate proof. Compounding withholds proof until it has had enough time to become embarrassing to ignore. That is why time matters more than almost anything else. And it is why I have always said the most important part of investing is not brilliance. It is duration. A person who starts small and early will often outrun a person who starts larger and later. That is not inspirational language. That is arithmetic. If one person invests a modest amount for decades, and another waits too long but then doubles the monthly contribution, the first person often still wins, because compounding had more years to accumulate upon itself. Time beats force more often than impatient people like to admit. And that is why the window matters so much. The longer you wait, the harder money has to work later to make up for time that has already left the room. This is why I always want younger people to understand one simple truth. You do not need to begin with a heroic sum. That is the difference. The first small automatic investment often matters more than the grand financial plan that sits in your Notes app for 2 years while you search. Research is often procrastination wearing glasses. The market does not know you are reading articles. It only knows whether money arrived. Now, I am not saying everybody must rush out and buy the same index fund tomorrow morning without understanding anything. I am saying that the delay people justify in the name of caution often costs them far more than the mistakes they are trying to avoid. Compounding is not forgiving about lost years. It is very generous to early consistency. That is the third pillar. Now let us move to something most people use as a scorecard, because it is easy to compare and easy to brag about. Income. This is where a lot of people quietly damage their whole financial worldview. They ask how someone is doing, and what they often really mean is, what does he earn? Salary has become moral theater. People use it as shorthand for intelligence, discipline, market value, adulthood, desirability, and success. That is nonsense. Income matters, of course. You cannot pay rent with philosophy, but income tells you almost nothing on its own about how well somebody is actually doing financially. I have known people with modest salaries who were building real wealth because their fixed costs were under control, their habits were clean, their savings were consistent, and their investments were quietly working in the background. And I have known people earning extraordinary amounts who were essentially laboring at an elite level simply to keep up with the cost of the identity they had built around themselves. Big apartment, big car, big holidays, big school fees, big lifestyle. No gap between what comes in and what goes out. That is not wealth, that is velocity. It looks impressive from the outside because the income number dazzles people who have never learned the right scorecard. The right scorecard is net worth, what you own minus what you owe, assets minus liabilities. That is the real picture. Cash investments, property equity, business value. If it is real and realizable against debts, loans, credit cards, lines of credit, anything dragging on your claim to your own future. This number is more confronting because it strips away performance. A large paycheck can flatter you. Net worth does not flatter you. It tells you whether your life is actually compounding in your favor or whether you are merely earning in place while obligations eat the back end of your effort. That is the number I care about. Not because it is perfect, because it is harder to fool. The first time many people calculate it honestly, they feel some version of grief that is normal. It is a clearer mirror than salary ever was. But mirrors are useful. Once you know where you stand, you can finally begin improving the right thing, instead of celebrating a number that lands in your account each month, while the deeper structure remains unchanged. Now we come to debt. This is the fifth pillar, and it is where moral language does a lot of damage. Debt gets talked about as though it were one thing, good or bad, responsible or irresponsible, a moral stain or a respectable tool. The truth is that debt, like almost everything in finance, depends entirely on its purpose, price, and structure. There is debt that drags you down. High-interest consumer debt is poison. Credit cards carrying balances at ugly rates. Payday loans, buy now, pay. Ladder habits attached to things that lose value the moment you walk out of the shop or finish the meal. Holiday debt, consumption debt. Debt taken to feel better, now at the cost of shrinking your future later. That is bad debt. It is not bad because it feels naughty. It is bad because the math is hostile. If you are paying 20% on a revolving balance, the debt is outrunning almost anything you could reasonably do elsewhere with your money. That is why such debt has to go first. Not because shame says so, because arithmetic says so. Then there is debt that behaves very differently. A mortgage at a tolerable rate on a sensible property, a business loan used to acquire or expand a productive asset, in some cases a student loan depending on structure, country, and probable return on qualification, debt that finances something likely to hold value or increase your earning power over time is a different creature entirely. Wealthy people understand this better than most ordinary households because they are less likely to speak about debt morally and more likely to think about it in spread terms. What does it cost me? What does it allow me to own or build? What is the likely return? That is the adult way to think. Not all debt is evil or all leverage is smart. Price and purpose. Always, if a debt is expensive and attached to something that does not build lasting value, it is a weight. Drop it. If the debt is cheap relative to what it finances and is used deliberately rather than emotionally, then it can be a tool, That is the distinction. And most people never get taught it cleanly enough, so they either become terrified of all debt or careless with all debt. Neither response is intelligent. Now we come to the sixth pillar, which people avoid because taxes feel boring until they become painful. Most people meet tax the first time as a shock. They do the math in their head based on the gross number. Then the payslip arrives, and reality has already taken its share. That is usually where the conversation ends. A sigh, a complaint. Move on, but if you never understand how tax actually works, then you are almost guaranteed to miss legal ways of keeping more of what you earn. And over a lifetime, ignorance here can be extremely expensive. The reason taxes confuse people is that they imagine one flat bite. That is not how most income tax systems work. In many places, you do not pay the same rate on every dollar from the first one onward. You move through thresholds, allowances, bands, rates. Different buckets of money are treated differently. Once you understand that, tax stops feeling like random punishment and starts feeling like a system you can navigate. Then come the tools: retirement contributions, tax-advantaged accounts, employer matching, shelters and wrappers that governments explicitly created to incentivize long-term saving or investment. What amazes me is how many people never bother learning where the legal free money sits in their own system. An employer match is one of the most beautiful things in finance because it is not speculative. It is not a future maybe. It is not a clever market move. It is a direct improvement in your wealth trajectory for doing something you should likely have been doing anyway. Ignore that and you are not being cautious. You are refusing a gift because the paperwork feels boring. Likewise with tax-advantaged investing accounts. Once you understand that some countries give you ways to invest without future capital gains tax, or with upfront tax relief, or with employer enhancement, the picture changes. You stop thinking only in terms of return before tax and begin thinking in terms of what you actually keep. That is real finance, not just what grows, what remains yours. And I think that may be the most mature way to understand all six pillars together. Money loses value quietly if you do not understand inflation. Saving and investing are different jobs. Time transforms small disciplined investing through compounding. Income is a weak scorecard compared with net worth. Debt can either be a weight or a tool depending on its structure, and taxes shape what your effort actually becomes after the system takes its share. That is the architecture. The rest really is detail, important detail sometimes, but still detail. What I like about the original document is that it presents these pillars in the right spirit, not as six separate trivia points to memorize. As six connected ideas make the whole money picture less mysterious. That is what I want for people. Less mystery, less guilt, less random stress, more clarity. Because money is already hard enough without confusion turning every normal decision into a moral event. If you understand these principles, then the subject starts becoming calmer. You know why holding too much idle cash can quietly cost you. You know why your emergency fund and your long-term investments should not be treated as the same pile. You know why starting matters more than perfection. You know why an impressive salary can coexist with weak wealth. You know why some debt should be destroyed and some should simply be understood. And you know why taxes are not just a reason to complain, but a structure to navigate intelligently. That is what financial adulthood actually looks like. Not flexing, not panic, not memorizing endless jargon, understanding the core forces well enough that your decisions stop being blind. And once the blindness goes, a lot of the shame goes with it. That matters. Because many people are not bad with money in the moral sense. They are simply under-taught. They were never shown the machinery. And when nobody shows you the machinery, you end up blaming yourself for outcomes that were at least partly the result of ignorance. The system quietly depended on you keeping. I do not like that arrangement. I would rather people see clearly, because when you see clearly, even if you are not where you want to be yet, you can move with confidence. You can stop guessing. You can stop worshiping income. You can stop confusing saving with investing. You can stop fearing all debt equally. You can stop treating tax as an unknowable fog. And most important, you can stop feeling as though money success belongs only to people who were born with a taste for spreadsheets and a permanent subscription to anxiety. It does not. Money gets much easier when the right ideas arrive in the right order. That is what these 6 pillars really are. Not cleverness, not advanced strategy, just the architecture. And once the architecture is right, a remarkable amount of your financial life starts making sense.